Welcome to the podcast, Eric. Again, just like the other guests we've had, absolute pleasure to have you on today. And we were just chatting there, but I missed you. I would have been at the Asia Pacific Society Physical Activity Conference in Auckland last year, but were you at that or?
I was not. I believe that was around the same time as I was still in the States for WNBF Worlds.
Right.
So
Okay.
I was too busy being starved and half naked, unfortunately.
And would I be correct in saying that's the time you on your pro card?
That was actually my pro debut. So,
Oh, so
uh,
previously.
yeah, I won my pro card in your gentleman's lovely country in Brisbane at the WNBF Australia show that was in October. And then my pro debut was competing at Worlds. If you get your pro card, that the first year you get your pro card, they enable you to compete in Worlds without qualifying. So I
Right. That makes
got to
sense.
sneak in there and get stomped by the pro middleweights. Yeah, it was good.
Is that Brisbane show pro AM as well?
That one is not a pro-am. It was actually the first year that they had the WNBF Pro, sorry, the WNBF Australia, and it was a pro qualifier, but there was not a pro division.
So I think it's in May next year. I was saying if there's an amateur, that'd be a good one to.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
crazy. It's been that long since you won your pro card. Because I remember seeing it on Instagram and it did
Mm.
not feel like that long ago, but it's been quite a while now.
It's been, yeah, I guess it's been 8 months, 9 months, if my math serves, which typically doesn't. So I'm probably at least off by a month.
Yeah, nice. And I remember hearing on the Revive Stronger podcast that you not too long ago were having a period of pretty awesome growth coming out of your competition season, which was a bit unexpected.
I think
Yeah.
that unicorn gains.
Mm-hmm. That is, those are Brian Miner's words, and I will definitely repeat them because since I was a young girl, I wanted to be a unicorn. That's been a goal of mine for a long time. So while I found out that I can't be a unicorn, that is reserved for only some mythical horses who grow a horn. I have been able to get dubbed as someone getting unicorn-like gains, and that's a close second that I'll take. So for sure, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy because, and no offense by this, you're not in your 20s anymore. So to be able to experience as much growth as you have, what do you put that down to?
That's a great question. And because I have just recently in April turned 29 for the 12th time. So you can do the math on that one. But you know how you mentioned before we started filming, you're 24. We're very
Yeah.
close in age if you just flip your age around the other way.
Right.
So as a as someone in his early 40s who actually competed and won a Masters Pro card as well as an Open Pro card last year in the same show, um, there's a couple of things at play where you would typically expect, and more importantly, not only am I also old, I've also been lifting a long time. So I've been training for 20 years. I had my 20-year anniversary of lifting back in May of this year. And typically, when someone is been training hard, progressively, seriously, like I wasn't mucking around from the very start, I was training extremely hard. You, there's not a whole lot going on unless you're doing something stupid early on. And um, I don't think I was doing that much stupid at the start. I was eating a lot and I was training very hard and I was doing some pretty sufficient overload in many different ways. Obviously, I improved my approach over time. But I think the biggest change, number one, that I'll put at the top of the list, is that when I first started lifting from the very beginning, I was equally striving to be strong and big. Um, I started competing in powerlifting in 2006. I did a push-pull unofficial meet at the YMCA, my first personal training job, which was a lot of fun. And then after that, 2007 was my first natural bodybuilding season. But from the very beginning, I wanted to be as big and as strong as possible. And I was competing in bodybuilding or powerlifting the whole time. And then even when I got starting into my academic phase of my life, I was very interested in let me learn how to do the Olympic lifts, and that became something I pursued. So by now, like if I look back on my 20 years of lifting, I've done 20 meets, with the majority of those powerlifting meets and a handful of weightlifting meets, and I've also done two strongman comps, one Highland Games competition, and then I've done, four bodybuilding seasons. And I want to say 18 shows or something like that. The numbers are a little off, but I've been a strength and physique athlete since the very start. But it wasn't until I turned pro last year in the WNBF, which has been a goal of mine for, geez, since the first show I attended was a WNBF show in 2005. Might have been 2006. I can't quite remember. And I got to test judge for the WNBF, and I learned about like first person what natural bodybuilding is, and there was a viable pathway. And I was like, one day I want to get my WNBF pro card. Didn't know it would take me, quite so long, but we got there eventually, team. And kind of the carrot and the positive reinforcement of going, you know what, you have more potential as a physique athlete than you do as a strength athlete, was really motivating to me for the first time to not have to spread my energy across training for strength and physique sports simultaneously. And obviously there are many great legends over the history of the Iron Game who are very high level strength and physique athletes simultaneously. But they are somewhat of a rare breed, built certain ways, typically not 6 foot, and have more general talent than I do, I would say, overall. So for me, I realized that if I wanted to really milk everything out of myself that I could to be as successful as I could in the sport that I participate in where I have the most potential, which is, looking reasonably good naked, then I thought, let me push all my chips into bodybuilding. So the biggest thing was that I no longer was having to spread my energy, and I took an approach of maximizing bodybuilding and moving some of those variables around, enabling more recovery, less fatigue, being able to suit movements to my body, not having to be married to any of the movements that are required for strength sport. That allowed me to do more volume. It allowed me to train closer to failure, and enabled me to have more favorable exercise selection. And those things all kind of happened at the same time, along with a real hefty dose of strong motivation. Nothing like turning pro and then getting smashed to bits, placing 7th out of 9th among the best guys in the world on a pro level world stage, to be like, let's go. So I think all those factors together were a pretty strong stimulus, and I've been really, really grateful, happy, and just excited, and feeling like a young man again, coming into the gym for the first time, just ready to chop in at the bit every time I step in the hallowed halls of the Iron Caverns where I hoist. It's been a good time.
So you said you've done 4 seasons, and in that time you've had 18 shows. So does that mean you peaked 6 times each of those seasons? Like, was that?
Well, one, like I mentioned earlier, my math is not great. And I think so. My very first season,
No,
07.
mine's not great either. I just said 6. I just said 4
Well,
seasons.
6 times 4 is
That's
24.
24. There you go, diet brain. We're both prepping. I'm losing my mind over here.
No, that's all good, mate. So I did 2 shows my first season, 5 shows my second season, 2 shows my third season, 4 shows. This is why the math doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I've done 5 seasons. That's the problem. That's why, folks. 07, 09, 2011, 2019, 2023. That's how we get to the number we're at. So I have done between 2 to 5 shows each one of those seasons. I've had two show seasons.
Seizures.
Whew, whew. I'm about to have a seizure. So I've had 2 show seasons, 2 5-show seasons, and then 1 4-show season in 2019.
That's really interesting that go back to what you said before, you put a lot of your progress down to, I suppose, that optimizing your stimulus to fatigue in your training. Because obviously, depending on your morphology, you could still get a lot of good gains out of, say, barbell squatting. But not, a lot of people are going to have a lot more fatigue from that than it's worth for bodybuilding alone. And it's a bit of a controversial point, I think, on social media a lot. The whole idea of stimulus to fatigue, a lot of people, the anti-science, anti-optimizers like to be like, you're worrying about the wrong things, you just train hard. But I suppose your situation is some evidence that we should be thinking about, stimulus to fatigue in our training.
To some degree. So here's the thing, though. People sometimes think of me as an exercise scientist or nutrition scientist, but I'm a sports scientist when it really comes down to it. And my quote unquote sport is strength and physique sport, right? Some debate as to whether or not the physique sport is a sport, but nonetheless, And I think a really important part of being a sports scientist is knowing the sports you're involved with. So while I'm not trained as a historian, I have become an amateur historian of both strength and physique sport. And it is 100% undeniable that some of the most impressive physiques ever that have been built were built with strength training. So if we talk about the 60s and prior, before there was a really clear impact of the Weider Empire, the IFBB, and training purely for physique sport, where there were not athletic point strength competitions and all this kind of being one blended uniform place, and before the advent of actual competitive powerlifting being its own sport and the overhead press in 72 getting taken out of Olympic weightlifting, there was a time where all strength athletes were bodybuilders and all bodybuilders were strength athletes. And you got guys like Tommy Kono winning gold medals across 3 or 4 weight classes in Olympic weightlifting at the Olympics, and also winning a Mr. Universe title. You know, you've got guys like Franco, even that late past that era, who are, you know, still very, very good powerlifters. And that was just the way it was done. So I think it's really important to point out that 90% of people, I would say, who are interested in getting as maximally strong or as maximally big as possible, they're not going to reach a point where there's a bottleneck where it is meaningfully impacted by needing to go, you know what, actually, I want to do hack squats, not squats. I think it is a case where you have someone who is not potentially super well built for certain movements. Like I said, I'm 6 feet tall. I'm not your typical build of someone who's going to be super successful in either strength sport or physique sport, to be honest. And I'm also someone who is approaching the zenith of like where my peak capacity and development is in both. So I have come to see that if I want to improve my total in, let's say, powerlifting, where I'm totaling in the low 600s at 93 or approaching 600 if I'm dieted down to 83. If I want to get stronger than that, knowing from my history what I have to do, it is 5 to 6 days of training, 2 to 3 hours, mostly focused on the comp specific lifts or variations of them. And then I'm seeing these marginal improvements in my total. So the question is, where is the time to then also make sure that, like, you know, the short head of my bicep femoris is growing and that I'm, you know, getting enough rear delt growth, or et cetera, et cetera. Likewise, I know that if I want to make noticeable improvements over a reasonably short time frame in my physique, I have to invest a lot of time and energy. And that means that even just working up to a single on my squat, bench, and deadlift is going to be taking away at least some time, if not some recuperative capacity, to where blending the two becomes at least a challenge from a periodization perspective, which is what I did before. I'm taking, to some degree, a known reduction in at least the efficiency of getting there, if not, you know, raising the ceiling a bit by only focusing on one. And I think that's a really important point, because most of the people consuming our content are people who are never going to have to worry about this. I mean, most strength and physique enthusiasts are not going to reach the top end of their potential as much as we all strive to do it. Other things get in the way first, and worrying about whether they should be doing a heel elevated Smith machine squat or a squat is not my first choice of what we need to discuss or talk about. It's probably things like setting an appropriate surplus, you know, making sure you're getting enough protein, being consistent in the gym, finding a way to overload you without injure you. And sometimes it matters with certain anthropometric characteristics. But it's almost exclusively a topic for people who are pushing above the standard within the sport already of either powerlifting or bodybuilding. If you talk to top level bodybuilders or powerlifters, they're big because they have to be at that level, or they're strong because they have to be because they've been overloading all that time. And the squat, bench, and deadlift might be decent vehicles, but you do start to have to play an optimization game once you're trying to become optimal. But I think 90% of people are not there yet, and it might be something worth talking about. But they're absolutely, the size of whether it's a big rock, a pebble, or a piece of sand changes over your training career. And Eric Helms in 2010 probably wouldn't have gotten much additional benefit to going, I'm going to go all in on bodybuilding, compared to now, where I physically don't have the recuperative capacities, nor do I have the time to improve in both simultaneously. At best, like what I mentioned, I know what I have to do to improve in powerlifting. or I know what I have to do to improve in bodybuilding. And at best, what I could do is then maintain the other quality. So it becomes just a simple logistics game. It's a similar principle to what is progressive overload for a given person, right? So if you were to give, and we'll use a different sport just to make this even more relatable. If you take a professional marathon runner and you have them start running twice per week at a 10-minute mile pace, they're going to see their VO2 max decline. They're going to actually start, getting in poorer shape. But if you take 90% of people on the planet and you have them start running, 5-10-minute miles twice per week, they're going to see marked improvements in health, right? So it really depends upon the person and the context.
Yeah, so I suppose don't get lost in the weeds with that kind of thing for most people. Something I've wondered when it comes to stimulus to fatigue, because I thought about it a bit, whether it is applicable for most people. I have a few clients who I guess you'd call them hobby builders,
Mm.
but they also work pretty hard jobs, like
Yep.
Monday to Saturday, working, 8 to 10 hours, a lot of physical work. So their training, that total training volume isn't super high, but their body, in terms of experiencing stress, doesn't know whether that stress is coming from the gym or coming from, you know, carrying wood or, concrete all day. So do you think it could have some more application for people like that, or still is it not really something to think about?
No, absolutely. I think I don't really think we need to refer to it as this new fancy term, stimulus to fatigue ratio, because this is not really a new concept. The idea is just good planning for training. What is the time availability of the person? What is their injury history? What is their constraints as far as equipment? What are their desires? And then what are the recuperative capacities and what does their prior training history tell us? And then therefore, what's the good choices to make as far as training planning on a microcycle level, on a mesocycle level, and then a within session level. So I think a lot of the times this stuff is going to become apparent and it's more important on the individual level than generally. Like I'm not a big fan of saying like a squat has a poorer stimulus to fatigue ratio than a hack squat, because that's going to be a lot less true for some people and a lot more true for others.
Yeah.
And when that ratio is so far below what is your theoretical ability to handle fatigue, does it matter? So like, let's say you've got somebody with the limb length to where they're super upright on the squat, they have no injury history, they get plenty of sleep, and they're only training 3 days per week. Who cares, right?
Yeah.
But if you take someone who has had prior hip surgery, they're 6 foot, they're in their 40s, they only have a certain amount of time to train, and they're trying to place in the top 5 at WBF Worlds, then you actually do have to ask that question, because you are stretching the capacities of what you have. So sometimes it's like this, like theoretically optimal only matters if you have to play the optimization game.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I think your point's well taken. Like if you've got somebody who is a manual laborer, they're going to have less recuperative capacity. They'll also have more work capacity, but they are also going to have less recuperative resources to dedicate to the same amount of training.
Yeah.
And it's the same way you think about strength conditioning in general. Like you have to be very careful when you've got, say, a motivated rugby squad who thinks like more is better and smashing myself is the way I make progress. The S&C comes in, teaches them some things. They need to be doing some weight training. But man, in the in season, it's like, what's the least amount we can do? And then you need to be ready to play. Like, please don't do any extra training outside of everything, because I'm carefully coordinating this with the dietitian, with the actual sports coach, and then with the S&C sessions. And if you're going on a random run or doing like some CrossFit class on the weekend, and I don't know about that, that's when guys start getting injured and we start losing games. And I think that's a very different scenario than when they're in the off season and you don't have to deal with it. So a lot of it is just kind of matching the recuperative capacity of the person to their ability to put a stimulus, to the demands of the time in a periodized fashion based upon what's going on. And then you just apply those concepts to each individual in their kind of circumstances. And to be honest, for physique and strength sport, we've got it easy. There's really only one type of dimension of training.
Yeah.
Most athletes will tell you, oh, your training is your sport. Okay. Yeah. Your sport's my training. Right. So, and the flexibility you have as a bodybuilder is nice. If if you get an injury or some type of issue, or you have an orthopedic concern that would, end the career of a powerlifter, you potentially still have a lot of options left as a physique athlete.
I love that you mentioned work capacity earlier as well, that those type of manual laborers would have that greater capacity to handle stress. Because I was chatting to one of my colleagues last week saying, man, I think I should go do some concrete in the off season, because I have some clients who can sleep 6 hours, work all day, come to the gym and train legs like absolute savages. Whereas I sleep, 7 hours and I feel the effects of my training compared to 8 hours.
Yeah, and there is actually a fair amount of data on how people respond to training when they have different intrinsic capacities, right? A useful heuristic, which I think is true enough, is that you essentially, you guys have probably heard of the fitness fatigue model, which is a useful model. It's wrong, as all models are, but it's a helpful way to help us understand things. And when you train, you get two things. You get some amount of fitness from it, and you get some amount of fatigue. And when you look at the combination of the two, you get some element of performance. And then if you overlay the biopsychosocial model on top of that, then maybe you have something that approximates reality, right? And it's a useful way of looking at things. So we also have people who seem to respond more to training. And I think it's helpful to look at response to both factors. So you can have someone, and I've worked with them, or I've seen them, who can be a high responder to the stimulus and a high responder to the fatigue. And these are the people who become like HIIT dogmatists and like, oh, you only need to do 3 sets and that's all you need to do. And then, hey, they do a little bit, they grow a lot, but they also get real beat up from it and they need their recovery. Then you get people who are maybe high responders to the stimulus, but they also don't respond very well to the fatigue. And now you've got a CrossFit champion, right? Then you layer training over that, because you can, of course, train yourself, like you mentioned, to become better able to handle more work. And that may or may not be useful. I think if you want to compete in CrossFit, for example, absolutely, because the output of your total amount of work is important. If you want to be a physique athlete or a strength athlete, you need to know, like, okay, well, if I acclimate myself to this higher workload, is it actually going to improve my bottom line? Because handling a bunch of work is not necessarily how much do I need to improve to get my strength, my force production capabilities up, or how much do I need to do to maximize the anabolic signaling. I could be doing a bunch of other adaptations that improve my ability to handle work, but we're doing work to grow or get stronger. We're not doing work to do work, unless, of course, you're in a sport where work is measured. There's kind of a cool study that was done in, I want to say they're middle distance runners, although I could be misremembering. But what they looked at was they looked at muscle carnosine levels, which are a proxy for whether it's more type 1 or type 2 dominant because of the muscle fiber characteristics. They didn't actually do biopsies. And they looked at an overreaching protocol in more slow twitch or fast twitch, quote unquote, dominant runners. And they found that when they used an overreaching protocol, the more fast twitch dominant runners were less likely to recover. And it was going to be, quote unquote, non-functional overreaching. And you saw measurements of, say, isometric knee extensor force were lower compared to those who were more slow twitch dominant. And I think, obviously, this isn't the same sport or even the same type of training, but that's maybe one of the many physiological characteristics that could influence the response of an athlete. We know that fast twitch fibers on average tend to, produce more power. Obviously, they contract faster, but they also tend to be a little more responsive to hypertrophy. They have more potential to be larger. So if you have more of those, maybe that's part of the characteristics of someone who is both quite fatigable, because that's the nature of fast twitch fibers. They fatigue quite quickly. They're not around for the long haul, if you will. And they also respond pretty well to training. So you can get people who operate along the spectrum where they could be either high responders to the stimulus and the fatigue, or one or the other, or some poor soul who has a high fatigue response, low stimulus response, and then maybe play chess. So
You mentioned, Eric, in your transition, I guess with the specificity of your training evolving more towards the physique sports now, that you're able to train with higher volume within your periodization. How has this kind of evolved over time, considering you've had a number of different elbow issues or injuries throughout your powerlifting career, and now, kind of focusing on physique-based sport. What would a typical kind of week or let's say mesocycle in the life or training of Eric Helms look like now in comparison to what it used to look like during your powerlifting days?
Yeah. So the limiting factors for me in powerlifting were orthopedic and for most part of what I could handle. I actually got bilateral FAI surgery in 2017 after dealing for 4 years with torn labrums and inability to squat low bar to depth with any kind of frequency or load, or I would get pain that actually impeded my ability to deadlift and squat. And that was ultimately also part of the reasons why I couldn't stick with Olympic weightlifting, was I didn't have the shoulder mobility, the elbow mobility, and I also had that hip issue. Really just not built for Olympic weightlifting, unfortunately. At least not at the age I got into it at. So powerlifting, I definitely found ways to work around that. One of them was pay for surgery, which doesn't work for many people. I was one of the fortunate ones where I was a good candidate for that, and it did actually remarkably improve my ability to hit depth, and I didn't have any issues, and I could tolerate then high volumes and high loading of squats and deadlifts. The elbow issues are actually pretty benign that I've been getting. They are much more related to how much arm volume do I do. So it's more of an accessory combination. And they were worse when I was powerlifting because of the relatively aggressive position of being in a low bar squat. And then I'm also a max legal width bencher. So when I do high volume specific training for powerlifting, I do start to get elbow pain. And what I eventually have to do is I have to bring the squat backward in the order. I'm typically doing squat, bench, deadlift. I have to bench first because I get elbow pain if I squat and then bench to the point where it limits my training. So when I'm doing, say, when I'm going into a peaking block, you're supposed to get more specific. I do weird stuff like bench before I squat, but it's really just to work around the elbow pain I'm getting. And what I would do as someone who is still interested in my physique and bodybuilding training while I was still powerlifting is I basically did almost all blood flow restriction training and high rep training and neutral grip work for my arm work. But one of the many ways in which not having to worry about bench and squat, or at least max legal width powerlifting arched bench and low bar squats, is that I can actually handle a fair amount of volume on my arms. Actually, a lot. Like if you count all my direct and indirect work, I'm doing in the mid 30 number of sets for biceps. Again, that's all rows, all lat pull downs, and bicep curls together. And in the mid 40s for my tricep work, which again is all pressing, shoulder and pecs, as well as any direct tricep work. So it's not as insane as it sounds. But
do you still implement a lot of BFR now, or was it more of like a low intensity technique to try and avoid pain or injury during those powerlifting days?
in the powerlifting days, I would do it prospectively because I knew what was going to happen with the amount of benching and squatting. But now it's prophylactically. So now I have only done BFR when my elbow tendonitis has started to crop up. I basically get medial epicondylitis if I do a really high volume of highly intense arm training. But I've been through more than 6 months, 7 months now of bodybuilding specific training. And without the inclusion of low bar squats and bench, it's only been an issue for maybe 4 weeks out of that amount of time. And I just have to think about what I'm doing, shift around my rep ranges, throw in some BFR, think about deloading, etc. And it's more of a training around it, let it resolve, and then I can get back on with the approach. So to answer your question more directly, what does my training split look like? I have 5 days of training per week that I'm doing. And I have a chest, back, and shoulders on day 1. Day 2 is legs and arms. Day 3 is a upper body day. Day 4 is a lower body day. And then day 5 is an upper body day with more emphasis on shoulders and arms. And as far as how I quote unquote periodize that, I would say it's more programming than it is periodization. There's not huge substantial shifts in the amount of sets that I'm doing, changes in exercise selection, or shifting in rep ranges. It's more of I have an auto-regulated progression model where I have first set RPE, last set RPE, and I'm letting the RPEs climb, or RIRs decline, so proximity to failure. And then I have an auto-regulated rep range. So as I move up, it's kind of what you'd call a reactive double progression model. So let's say, for example, I meant to start at a 8 RPE on RDLs. By my fourth set, I'm trying not to let it get above a 9 RPE, and then I'm training in the 5 to 8 rep range. Once I can get through 4 sets for 8 reps with my first set or my last set RPE in place with the same load, then I'll do a load progression. So as an example, let's say I'm doing 140 kilos and I'm able to get 4 sets. First set's at an 8, second set's at an 8, and I go up to 8.5 and a 9, or even if it goes up to a 9.5 because of fatigue, sweet. I've got my 4 sets at 8. Now I'll do 142 or 145, something like that, the next time I do that exercise. So I have a progression model, but as far as what changes mesocycle to mesocycle, that's more from just a orthopedic consideration, or if I'm getting a little mental burnout or staleness on a given exercise, I'll swap it out just from kind of logistics and organization.
You mentioned the amount of volume that you're doing for your, say, triceps. And a personal question that I had around this, and I often think about this when I'm hearing researchers talk about number of sets, volume. There is so much variability because we're using number of sets as a way to quantify how much stress we're experiencing, I suppose, in a study. But there is so much variability, like, how much stress the triceps experience from a compound press versus isolation. If you are standardizing everything and keeping things at, say, 2 RIR across the whole study, but you rest, you sleep a little bit better. So your perception of what 2 RIR changes from one day to the next. How do you try and quantify this, or how do you reconcile this in research to try and make it as valid as possible? And should we really be looking at numbers too closely at all?
I think you'd say like the validity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's something I wonder because, I'm not a researcher.
Sorry, the reliability of the data. Sorry.
Yep. It's a different question for research than it is in practice.
Yeah.
So I think the important thing here is essentially statistics. So without going over the heads of any listener here, this essentially boils down to having a manageable level of variance, or basically this signal to noise ratio, if you will, and then being able to contextualize the findings. So we have 2 relatively large scale meta-analyses where we are looking at volume in this way for hypertrophy, and then we also have some for number of sets, like Ralston 2017 for strength. And you have to decide how you code things when you run a meta-analysis, right? So if you're coding things as the number of sets per muscle group per week, and the established method of doing that is if it's involved in that movement, direct or indirect, primary, synergist, secondary, you have to have some categorization, right? That categorization is artificial, but it doesn't necessarily matter if you're being consistent. And then it's just going to play out the way it plays out. And then you have to go, do I have enough statistical power? So one of the ways this potentially plays out is if you look at Baz Val's 2021 or 2022 meta-analysis of volume, is they found there was no significant difference in the categorization of the 12 to 20 or the 20 plus set range for all the muscle groups except triceps, which seemed to do a little bit better on 20 plus. And you're like, oh, what's unique about the triceps that it requires more volume? That's probably not it. What it probably is that we're looking at a bunch of studies where they're counting shoulder press and chest press as well as tricep pushdowns on a 1-to-1 basis. So you just have to know the limitations of the findings you have. So in research, you need to make a conclusion that integrates our theoretical knowledge with the actual empirical data. And instead of just going, right, in practice, we need more than 20 sets on average to start for tricep volume, and then you start giving someone 20 sets of tricep pushdowns, that's actually not an evidence-based perspective because you're not integrating the empirical with the theoretical and thinking about the limitations of the data. Now, if you were to give someone 25 sets of triceps and you're actually counting every single sets of shoulder, bench, decline, dips, and everything all together, fantastic. And then you also have to think, okay, what other research is out there that might inform me as if my goal is to build triceps because they're a weak point for me, because of that meta-analysis, should I choose a shoulder press and equally weight it as a tricep pushdown? Well, no, because some of the acute studies and biomechanical data we have would indicate there's probably better choices. I'd probably choose a tricep isolation exercise. So it's more of a question of, if you want to base your training on research, you need to speak the same language while understanding the limitations. So in practice, it's a different answer. It is, how do I count my volume in the first place? And if you want to say, oh, I'm being evidence-based because I'm doing 10 to 20 sets, and I go, oh, okay, how are you counting your sets? Well, I count my presses as half a set for triceps, and then I count my tricep pushdowns as 1-to-1. And I go, well, what's that based upon? Oh, the meta-analysis by Schoenfeld and Bas-Val, 10 to 20 sets. And I'm like, well, they didn't count it that way. So you're not being evidence-based, right? If you want to count your volume that way, that's fine. But don't then think that you have a representative meta-analysis to base it off of. That's just the way you're counting it. And then you make adjustments from there when only comparing you as a 1-to-1 case study in practice. So it's a mismatch in the language. And you see this a lot, the debates around how should we count compound sets towards a given muscle group. And there's two different answers. If you want to inform your set volume based upon the data we have on set volume, you need to count it the same way it's counted in that study. But then you also need to have some degree of understanding of how things work in the real world and go, right, if I'm plateaued on my chest, or I'm plateaued on my tricep, or if I'm plateaued on my bicep, or if I want to increase effective volume for a given muscle group, I need to be intelligent in my exercise selection. And then I just need to count things in a consistent way so that I know when I change X, it has an impact on Y in practice. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah.
In the context of looking at those factors in isolation, would like a meta-regression model make more sense, I guess, in some circumstances? So if you're looking at those other factors like sleep and nutrition and recovery.
Absolutely. So there's a number of ways you could do this. We're going to start talking stats now, and I don't know how feasible that is for podcasting, but
Yeah.
so you can do what's called just a simple categorical meta-analysis comparison, right? Where you go, let's take all the studies that are in this set range, or in this set range, or in this set range. And then we have an inclusion criteria where they're operationally comparing a lower versus a higher volume. And then we can have just basically group-based comparisons, if you will, on the studies that fell in these different categorical analyses. Or you can do what's called a meta-regression, which is very similar to just doing a regression in an individual study, where you're trying to see the continuous effect of a variable, right? Which in this case would be number of sets per week, and then the outcome variable being change in hypertrophy, right? So a meta-regression is really useful because you can look at the continuous effect of a variable that we think probably has that type of relationship. And then even more so, if you have more advanced statistical models, you can look at it as if it's not potentially linear. Like, is this a curvilinear relationship? Is it logarithmic? Does it plateau and start to create what we think is the start of an inverted U, which we sometimes hypothesize are the way adaptations occur? And big shout out to the team over at FAU, the guys over at Data Driven Strength. You're probably familiar with the preprint meta-regression that was done on proximity to failure, led by recently successfully defended Dr. Zach Robinson now. He just finished his PhD over at FAU. One of his colleagues, Josh Pelland, he is the lead author on what is soon to be preprinted, a meta-regression looking at volume. And just to give a little bit of a hint at what it looks like, because I've seen some of it, I'm on his PhD dissertation committee. It is a curvilinear relationship. And you can, even more so than looking at whether it's a linear relationship or curvilinear, you can also do what you're saying is basically do moderator analyses.
Yeah.
So, okay, if I hold X constant or control for Y, how does it change the estimations and the best fit for that model? And so, for example, one outcome of this could be, if we look at that RIR, or repetitions in reserve meta-regression led by Robinson, is that when they specifically looked at data of higher loads, when you're lifting 80% of 1RM estimated or higher, all of a sudden, the beneficial effect of getting closer to failure was no longer significant. Or I think they used the Bayesian model, so that's probably not the right terminology, but there was no longer a meaningful effect of being closer to failure when you're lifting heavy enough on outcomes for hypertrophy, right? So now you can look at the interaction of variables, which is really important because we do think there's an interaction between volume, intensity, frequency, training age, nutrition, recovery, et cetera. Yeah.
There's such a heap of literature looking at the use of RPE in professional sport as well. And because it's such a non-invasive tool, really simple and quick to administer, to ask an athlete for their, how hard the intensity of their session was, times that by the duration of the session, and you've got a internal load measure. But the nature of it being so subjective, I guess, is this something we've obviously looked at a bit of your research before we come on here, but you've looked at RIR and the use of RPE within, strength and performance or physique sport. Is this something that you've tried to quantify more throughout your research, and what kind of struggles or barriers have you noticed with using RPE in your research?
In my research specifically, I haven't run into a ton of it, but that's because the rationale for the research I did on RPE was built upon some of the prior issues that happened when they were taking the original Borg RPE and or versions of it and applying it to resistance training. So if you're in the powerlifting world, you think RPE, you think Mike Tuchscherer, you think 1 to 10 scale that is the inverse of RIR. You think basically RPE is defined as how close to failure am I. But if you have been involved in the literature, you know that since 1970, we've had a Borg RPE scale, and that was in the literature exclusively until 2016, when Zerdos was the first one to actually introduce an RIR-based RPE scale into the literature. So we have literally 46 years of that not being the way RPE is used in exercise science. And there was a handful of studies where the Borg RPE scale, typically the category ratio scale, which is 0 to 10, not the 6 to 21, was used, because how weird is it to say to somebody, hey, how hard was that set, 6 to 20? And you're like, what?
Well, based on heart rate, right? And
exactly.
But I remember using that when I was doing my bachelor degree at UNSW, when we were in the strength clinic. We were using that to conduct strength assessments and adjust the intensity of training programs for different clients. And, looking back on it now, it doesn't make as much sense as the CR10, obviously.
No, for one, it's non-intuitive. It's really useful, like you said, 6 to 20 roughly scales to 60 to 200 beats per minute. And when you go back to the literature in the 70s and 80s, pretty strong correlation to heart rate when you look at group averages. And it was used in like graded exercise tests for cardiorespiratory fitness. And you would see very strong correlations between higher heart rates, higher RPEs, and then higher objective intensities on the treadmill, right? You can program cardiovascular intensity with it, or at least you can monitor it quite easily with that 6 to 20. Then late 80s CR10 scale comes around. Now it's a little more intuitive, but it still has issues. So the reason I did my PhD and the reason why Mike Tuchscherer modified it just in practice to not be the Borg RPE scale is because you get funky things when you start asking people 1 to 10, how hard was that set? You probably saw this in practice, and it's been objectively observed in literature. You can have someone go to failure on a set, which, depending upon how we define effort or exertion, basically means they could not have made that set any harder without doing some type of, quote unquote, intensity technique afterwards, right? But they'll rate it as a 7 or 8 out of 10. So the question is like, well, then how do we get to a 10? And the issue there is that it's related to anchoring. So one of the ways you can improve the reliability of Borg RPE scores is that you have them do something that is equivalent to like a 3, a 5, a 7, and a 10. And you tell them that's what that is. Now you've experienced it. And then the scores become much better. Because if you read the side of the scale on like the Borg RPE scale, it goes from like light, moderate, off day, rest, hard, very hard, maximal, right? And for many people, no matter how hard a set of 10 is, it doesn't feel like maximal exertion. If you take someone who is in the military or special forces or an elite endurance athlete, and you have them do a set of 10 to failure on a bicep curl, how hard is that going to be compared to what they've experienced as maximal exertion? Not very much. And they're going to rate it lower. But if you tell them that a 10 RPE means I could not have done another rep and I couldn't have done that same set with even at 2.5 kilos more, Now they actually have something objective to anchor that score to, and the reliability tightens up quite nicely. And that was the rationale for why I said, hey, we should probably be looking at resistance training based RPE being related to proximity to failure, because that is one of the ways that we measure an element of effort in resistance training. And those and all the data after that has indicated much tighter findings. So there was a meta-analysis published by Halprin and colleagues, where it was a scoping review plus meta-analysis looking at the accuracy of RIR ratings. And on average, they found that people were off by 0.95. So pretty tight, off by less than a rep. Relatively wide confidence interval, but we're talking about less than a rep off to as much as 2 reps off if you were to look at the whole 95% confidence interval, which is really useful, because being 1 or 2 reps off compared to other metrics that we have, like going off of an 8-week-old percentage, doing a percentage of an 8-week-old 1RM test to prescribe reps, given the difference between people and repetitions, you're even dealing with even less precision. So that's kind of why the importance of anchoring your RPEs and resistance training to something that is more resistance training specific is important, and why I did my research the way we did, and why we're seeing RIR becoming a more constantly used variable in resistance training studies and practice.
Yeah, that's really great insight. And it was also used in Martin Ruffalo's paper, which I believe
Yes.
you were a part of. And I was lucky enough to go down to Melbourne a few weeks ago to JPS and meet those guys there. And a question that I posed, I believe, to Brandon Kempton when we chatted to him in one of our initial episodes was around that paper. A lot of the questions that people would have is, okay, so we're getting this idea that maybe training, say, 1 rep in reserve is just as stimulative as going to failure, and potentially, less fatiguing as well. But a lot of the top bodybuilders all throughout time have constantly pushed to train to failure, beyond failure, and constantly trying to increase that ceiling of intensity. So for the average person, how would you best integrate information from research like this into training?
For the average person, easy answer.
Let's say, I don't know, the average bodybuilder, hobby builder,
Okay, so the average pretty damn serious person. Yeah, I think we know enough now to say that there is a relationship between proximity to failure and the stimulus. Where that matters is going to be context dependent. But I would say like a really, really decent heuristic is probably like, most of your sets should be either to failure or at a quote unquote 0 RIR, just technically not failure. It means you still completed the rep, but you don't think you could have done another one, or 1, 2, or 3 reps in reserve, depending upon the goal, depending upon the amount of volume and your individual response, what you like to do. Because like you said, now Dr. Ruffalo's, primary thesis study, which I had the honor of being on his supervisory team as an external supervisor. He did a great job, really, really well-designed study. In the most highly trained sample we have in all of the prior literature on RPE looking at hypertrophy and strength outcomes, there was no significant difference between a group that was between 1 to 2 RIR and a 0 RIR. I should say no meaningful difference, again, Bayesian model. And that was a really well-designed study within subject design, really good control. We assessed to make sure they were accurately rating it, and we used a relatively externally valid while internally controlled design to do that. So I think we have to hold these things as both being true. Like, yes, technically, based upon the meta regression from Robinson, it's probably better to be at failure if we control for everything else. But in the real world, when we're not controlling for everything else and we're not looking at a meta regression within a 8-week period, we're probably going to see minimal differences at most between being close to failure or actually at failure. Now, there's going to be differences in so we don't get into the weeds. 0 to 3 RIR, scale it based upon your periodization cycle, training, fatigue, personal preference, yada yada yada. When we really get down to it, though, there's a lot of things that go into that. So we have data showing that even at 50 and 70% of 1RM on a bench press, if you're putting forth maximal intent to accelerate the concentric load, we're seeing EMG values which would indicate relatively close to maximal activation I should say, excitation of the pecs. But then we see a scaled increase in the contribution of the synergists. So like the triceps, as you're getting closer to failure or as the load goes up, which is being closer to failure, because you can do less reps with 90% than you can with 70% or 50%. So you may get some slightly different responses. And we saw hints of this in Martin's study, where in the group that was training to failure, they saw slightly different growth patterns in some of the heads of the quadricep, like the rec fem versus vastus lateralis, which are potentially going to be more or less activated in the different exercises, like the leg press or leg extension, which were trained at 2 different RIRs. So it is possible that, based on exercise selection, based upon other factors in your training program, that there's a rationale for different RIRs. But you'd have to really start thinking through those examples, and they're going to be more case by case. One of the practical ways to really kind of help you understand this is that back work, if someone is performing traditional full range of motion back work, I generally almost always program that a lot closer to failure because of the strength curve of those exercises. Biomechanically, they are very challenging to get a full rep, and they're really hard in that shortened position. The strength curve is not great for a stimulus perspective, knowing that the lengthened position of a muscle is a more generally stimulative position for a muscle. And that's when it's easy on a row. If you were to say do rows where you only did the first third of the range of motion, and you just did as many as you could with the same load as doing the full range of motion, you'd probably get twice as many reps or somewhere around there. So to go to a 10 RPE, to go to a 0 RIR on, say, a cable row where you're using strict form, maintaining the same back angle, and you only count the reps if your palm touches your abdomen. And as soon as your palm can't quite touch, that's a 10 RPE. You've probably got another 5 reps where you're maybe a few centimeters from your abdomen, another 5 reps where you're doing the majority of the range, and then another 3 reps where you're only getting half the range. So yeah, it's a 10 RPE, but how much of an actual stimulus is, say, the lats getting? Compared to, say, your pecs on a bench press, where failure occurs maybe 2 inches off your chest, and that's primarily just due to the stretch reflex. And if you were to actually do a pause bench, you're barely going to get off your chest at all. So the hardest portion of pressing and, say, like squatting is in the most lengthened position, while the hardest position or the hardest portion of like pull downs and rows is actually in the most shortened position. So an RPE 10 is not the same in terms of the overall fatigue it's going to generate on a back exercise than it is on a pressing exercise or a squatting exercise. So it could be very simply as, and how often do you hear like the heuristic of like, it seems like you should probably do twice as much pulling volume as pec volume because of, I don't know, joint health. But it might be that people just don't seem to see as much of a stimulus or an effect, and they have to make up for these relatively poor biomechanics inherently in these exercises by doing more volume. And people don't really report the same kind of DOMs in their back musculature as they do in their pressing musculature, even when they're training at similar volumes, similar RPEs, or even higher volumes and higher RPEs on their back work. So I think there's a lot of nuance here. It's decent to tell people 0 to 3 RIR, but ultimately it comes down to training age. What are your weak points? What's your exercise selection? What's your adherence? And all these factors. And I think that is the next phase of a lot of the research we need to be doing, is looking at these interaction effects and figuring out which ones are going to, impact our decisions as practitioners.
Yeah, I think we talked to Brandon a bit about that in terms of maximal strength testing, and it's a bit harder when you're working with the rowing, pulling movements as opposed to pressing or lower limb.
Yep.
That's also why it's great, or I like, being able to extend a set on back exercises, whether that's through length and partials or, if it's cable row, using the erectors a little bit just to get that extra momentum and range. You get a lot more of a stimulus. And
Yeah.
look, Eric, we'd love to keep chatting all day, to be honest. We have a lot of questions, but I know that you are a busy guy. We are conscious of time. So to wrap up, there may be a lot of people who, there'll be a lot of people who have heard of you, but even some who haven't heard of you. So if you'd like to let them know where to reach out, plug anything you're doing over the next, 6 months, then feel free to do so.
Well, first off, Hayden, great to meet you both. I would love to come back on because we can always chat about another topic and dive in, and I'd be honored to be back on. I appreciate you guys having me on. And for anyone who is wanting to get more of my perspective on things, first, shucks, thank you so much. Second, where to go to do that. probably the one-stop shop if you're interested in more of the bodybuilding side of things is 3dmusclejourney.com. That is the number 3, the letter D, then musclejourney.com. From there, you can find links to our podcast. You can find links to our YouTube. You can also find our old blog articles. You can sign up for our newsletter, or you can even go to the 3DMJ Vault and take some of our practical courses. Relevant to this conversation would be bodybuilding program design, which we have a course which I teach the theory side of it, and then we get into the weeds with Brad and Berto, 2 of our coaches. And if you're interested in really just nerding out, like getting hardcore, there's also links there to my books, The Muscle and Strength Pyramids, where I kind of teach the fundamental basics of training and from a hierarchical perspective. And then if you really, really want to regularly nerd out on a monthly basis, then Monthly Applications in Strength Sport is the research review that I do with Dr. Mike Zerdos, Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple, and the other Eric, Dr. Eric Trexler, where we release issues where we're staying up to date with the most relevant literature that's currently coming out. And then, of course, if you want to hear me appear on these amazing podcasts like this one and being on other people's platforms, definitely follow me at Instagram at Helms3DMJ, and I will always post when I'm on other people's platforms who've given me the grace and the time and the privilege to talk with them about lifting.
Beautiful. I think one extra thing just before we wrap up, we had a question from a listener that we wouldn't mind you answering if you have time.
Let's go.
And that was, how has your mindset changed or shifted since solely just focusing on bodybuilding?
I'd say the big shift is thinking more about how do I optimize my recovery on kind of a more microcycle scale. The difference between, in my mind, bodybuilding and powerlifting or strength sport or sport in general is that you have this objective performance metric and you can kind of work backwards and you can plan on how I need to get there and you can adjust based upon knowing where you need to go. But bodybuilding to me feels almost more like, I would imagine, because I'm not actually a farmer. I was not raised to milk cows or do any of these things, but you're trying to constantly cultivate the ideal environment that should be conducive to growth. Like, how do I make it so that I can push my recovery capacities, do a whole lot of work at a high intensity? How do I bring the mindset that I need to the gym? How do I, each set, maintain intentionality, pushing on the concentric, controlling the eccentric, and taking myself really to the true RIR I'm trying to get to? How do I choose the right exercises? How do I manage my joint issues that pop up? What decisions do I make today on what rep range? Maybe I'm going to shift from the 8 to 12 to the 6 to 8 or to the 15 plus based upon whether I'm feeling like I've got a little more gumption to do high reps, but my elbow's hurting, or vice versa, so that I can keep creating this very, very consistent stimulus. Bodybuilding is so much about rinsing and repeating the same process, but still being extremely intentional and being okay with doing the same damn thing over and over while being incredibly present. While I think powerlifting, there's a little more of a phasic experience to it. So I think it requires a slightly different mentality in its approach, sport versus, gardening.
What an amazing way to wrap up. That was really insightful.
I was very resonate a lot with that. And I just think in terms of you being able to apply yourself from a research perspective while you're dieting down for comp and controlling those external factors, which try and disrupt that consistent environment that's optimal for growth. So, mate, there's so much more that I need to ask you. I've got pages worth of notes, and so I'm gonna hit you with an email after this, and we'll tee up another one when you got some time. So thanks, Eric. Thanks for your time, mate.
Thanks, mate.
My pleasure, and I'd love to be back on. Thanks, guys.